please contact the REMS TA Centre at info@remscacentre.org. You may also request technical assistance using the Q&A tool. Questions are viewable to the webinar moderator only. Finally, to ask a question, use the Q&A tool on your screen to send your message to the facilitator. Questions will be answered in the order in which they appear and as time permits following the presentation. If you would like to submit questions for the question and answer portion of this webinar and are able to do so via the box provided by Adobe, please email your question again to info@remscacentre.org. Let's first take a look at the agenda of today's webinar. We will begin with a brief introduction to behavioral threat assessments in schools. We'll use the term threat assessment instead of behavioral threat assessment for the remainder of this webinar for the purposes of brevity. We'll then list what the REMS team considers to be some of the common elements of an effective threat assessment. After each element is listed, our co-presenters will discuss some of their experiences with the elements. We'll close the question and answer session during your opportunity to ask our guest presenters questions. Our two presenters today are Donna McAllis, Manager of the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety, and Dr. Dolores Robertson, Threat Assessment Supervisor at the Prince William County Public Schools. I'll provide more of an introduction to them later in the webinar. To help provide some perspective, I'd like to define what a threat assessment is. The process has been defined as a fact-based, investigative, and analytical approach that focuses on what a particular student is doing and saying, and not on whether the student looks like those who have attacked schools in the past. Threat assessment emphasizes I'd like to point out a couple of things from this definition. First, a threat assessment focuses on what the student is doing and saying, not on what they look like. Basis for a threat assessment is not hunches or stereotypes by the observer based on an individual's appearance or look. Second, a threat assessment identifies and evaluates where the student truly is at risk. A threat assessment can be tested before an actual threat has been made. The student is seen to pose a threat. The assessment is also conducted to determine whether or not the student poses themselves or others. The Safe School Initiative, which I referenced on the previous slide, is a joint initiative between the U.S. Secret Service and U.S. Department of Education, or ED, to examine the pre-incident thinking and behavior of 41 student attackers in 37 incidents between 1974 and 2000. Information that before means, and 2, the student attacker purposely chose his or her school as the location of the attack. The two images on the left of the screen are the covers of two of the SSI's reports titled Threat Assessment in School, a guide to managing threatening situations and to creating a safe schools climate, and the final report and findings of the Safe School Initiative, Implications for the Prevention of School Attacks in the United States. These resources can be downloaded from the handouts box on your screen or from the TA Center's website. Amongst other things, the SSI has 10 key findings, such as targeted violence in schools are rarely selling reported acts, and others usually knew about the topic of war or class. The SSI also suggested that threat assessments may be an effective way to prevent targeted violence in schools by students. The SSI focused on targeted violence, where schools and facilities selected as the locations to attack, and not simply a random site of opportunity. The focus was on targeted violence by students at school. However, And as you'll hear throughout this webinar, all districts and their community partners also need to make their own decisions about elements of threat assessment, including partners' roles and responsibilities. For example, decisions can be made about 1, the type of threat or threat assessed. Schools and districts may choose to focus on just types of violence or have a broader focus on threats such as bullying, self-harm, and or fighting. And 2 is the population posing the threat. The focus of the SSI approach is on students. But schools and districts may choose to look at threats posed by adults too. For example, sometimes custody disputes between parents make their way to the school and become a threat to one or more students. Sometimes there are threats to teachers by other adults in their lives. The threat assessment focuses just on student threats. Schools and districts may want to consider putting mechanisms in place to address threats made by adults. This may involve, for example, the district's human resources department working with local law enforcement. At latest is that while the focus of the SSI approach is on target violence, having a threat assessment process in place can impact other areas of school climate and safety and emergency management. For example, mechanisms to report threats can help with communication between students and school officials to help reduce other threats or incidents, such as bullying. The purpose of a threat assessment may differ between localities based on the needs of the community, district, and school. For the purposes of this presentation, we will focus on targeted violence in schools for students. So, what is a threat assessment? A threat assessment is a multi-step process that is designed to 1. Gather information from a variety of sources. 2. Provide facts. 3. Determine whether the student poses School Emergency Operations Plan, also known as the School Guide, which is available for download.
I apologize. Good afternoon, everyone. This is actually Jack Adele at the BEMS TIA Center. We do apologize for the technical difficulties with the audio stream. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to check in with the Q&A box on the right side of your screen, we've entered in a telephone number and a password for you to dial into the webinar using your telephone connection. Just to repeat that, our apologies for the technical difficulty with the audio stream. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to dial into the number and password that appears in the Q&A box on the right side of your screen, that should resolve the difficulty with the audio and with the sound. Thank you so much for your flexibility. This is a reminder, that number is 877-860-3058 and the password is 404381#.
Hello everybody, and again thank you for joining us. We apologize for some of the technical difficulties that we've been having. Just as a reminder, please mute your telephones or your computer speakers so we don't have any feedback. We really appreciate that. If you're unable to stay with the webinar time, the webinar will be archived on our webinar page and we'll discuss shortly. The Director of Research and Development at the Readiness and Emergency Management School Technical Assistance Center, also known as the Readiness PA Center. I'd like to welcome the webinar for the School Behavioral Processing Team. This represents information that states, districts, and schools may want to consider as they implement new or reform existing data processes and teams. This will occur for the state and local representatives on their experiences of best specimens in schools. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the WebCA Center's website via our website page. It's on Data 416 bed. Along with an accompanying resource list following this event. Before we start, there are a few brief housekeeping items to cover. The following tips will help ensure you're able to download files that will questions, ask questions during this event. Prior to the resources referenced in this webinar, please select the name of the resource or resources you would like to receive and click the download start button. Then, if you're using a telephone and calling into this, please put the phone on mute. We're still getting quite a little bit of background noise. We appreciate that. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please contact the WebCA Center at webcacenter.org. There's also technical assistance the Q&A
the purpose of the threat assessment may differ between localities based on the needs of the community, district, and school. For the purposes of this presentation, we will focus on targeted violence in schools by students. So, what is a threat assessment? Threat assessment is a multi-step process that is designed to 1. Gather information from a variety of sources. 2. Evaluate the facts. 3. Determine where a student poses a threat. And 4. Manage the providing potential victims. Or review components of them. The 6-step planning process, which is shown on your screen, involves the following. Step 1, form a collaborative planning team, where a planning team is established with representatives from the school, district, community partners, and other stakeholder groups, such as parents, guardians, or students. Step 2, understand the situation. Planning team lists threats and hazards to the school and surrounding community, assesses those risks, and prioritizes them for inclusion in the EOP. In step 3, determine goals and objectives, and step 4, plan development, identify courses of action. The planning team determines goals and objectives and identifies courses of action addressing the hazards and threats identified in step 2. Step 5, plan preparation, review, and approval. The planning team creates a draft EOP, circulates the draft to obtain feedback from those responsible for implementing the plan, make a credit on a comment, and obtains approval from the appropriate leadership. Finally, in step 6, plan implementation and maintenance. The plan is reviewed, revised, and maintained. Also, exercises are conducted to validate the plan. The school guide points out that in step 2 of this process, planning teams may use numerous assessments, including threat assessment and culture and climate assessment. If you would like more information on the 6-step planning process, please visit the REMC website, where there are numerous other resources to help, including webinars, publications, and online courses. EOPs are traditionally broken down into 3 major sections: the basic plan, functional annexes, and threats and hazard specific annexes. The basic plan section of the school EOP provides an overview of the school's approach to emergency operations. The functional annexes section details the goals, objectives, and courses of action of essential cross-cutting functions that may be needed in a variety of emergencies, such as evacuation, lockdown, communication, and accounting for students. The threat and hazard specific annexes section specifies the goals, objectives, and courses of action that a school will follow before, during, and after a particular type of threat or hazard, such as active shooter, hurricane, or fire. Generally, human-caused incidents are classed as threats, natural disasters are classed as hazards. Of note, the planning team may want to consider including specific information on how to respond to target violence in schools in a behavioral threat assessment annex and several functional annexes. For example, information can be integrated into a behavioral threat assessment annex, which addresses how to respond to targeted violence in schools. In developing goals, objectives, and courses of action, the planning team may want to consider which representatives should participate on the threat assessment team, and how the team will help to ensure that information complies with applicable privacy, civil rights, and other applicable laws. Public health, medical, and mental or behavioral health annex. Planning team may want to consider issues such as how the school will support the needs of students by the threat assessment team, and the security. The things to consider, such as how to respond to threats identified by the threat now going to move into the second section of the webinar, which will be a discussion of some of the common elements that affected threat assessment. First, I'll briefly describe how these elements were identified and then list the 8 elements. Of note, and what I've already mentioned before, ultimately the school, districts and community partners should make the final decision about what the threat assessment process looks like. We'll then hear about the experiences with these elements from a couple of practitioners in the field. These co-presenters are Dolores Robertson and Donna McAllis. I'll introduce them now. Dr. Dolores Robertson is the supervisor of threat assessment for Prince William County Public Schools, a school division which serves more than 87,000 students in 95 schools. She is responsible for supporting schools as they identify, assess, and intervene with students who pose a risk of targeted violence. Dr. Robinson has a leadership role in developing the threat assessment protocol, centralized, proactive, intervention focused, that emphasizes the importance of departmental and interfaith collaboration. School psychologist who completes their graduate work at George Washington University. He's worked in education for over 20 years as a school psychologist, central office administrator, private practitioner. Working in the area of school safety since 1955. She began her career with the Chesterfield County Police Department as the county's first child safety coordinator, and thereafter worked in 37 elementary schools and 11 middle schools. In 1998, she joined the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services as part of school resource officer training. In 2000, Donna assumed the responsibility of director of the newly legislated Virginia Center for School Safety, which was established as a result of Stormwater tragedy. She is currently a manager within the law enforcement division of the VHAS, being public safety training to the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety, which was charged with legislative statute in July 2014. Donna is a graduate of the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. The common efforts we'll discuss shortly are based on a comprehensive list of the review of findings from the SSI, existing threat assessment approach, for insight, and through the subject matter expertise of the event. The first 4 common elements of an effective assessment that they are 1, races, which were K through 12 school safety. Threat and target, and 8, continually evaluated and adjusted. First element is that the threat assessment approach is integrated into the larger framework of K through 12 school safety and emergency management. A threat assessment is a tool, along with other programs and initiatives, such as bullying prevention, to help build a school climate. This positive school climate is a feeling of trust between students and teachers or staff to help prevent violence from occurring. Yet the staff found students who have previously come forward with information about possible attacks which prevented them from occurring were influenced by positive relations with one or more adults, teachers or staff, and or a feeling within the school that the information will be taken seriously and addressed appropriately. As we've already discussed, information about threat assessment can be used in the planning process to help understand the situation, replacing or revising an EOP. Information about the threat assessment process can be included as a separate behavioral threat assessment annex in the school's EOP and in functional annexes such as the public health, medical, and mental or behavioral health annex, security. Or any experiences with this or comments on addressing common element number 1? can't hear you at the moment. Are you on mute?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay. I think it's important to provide a brief description of what the threat assessment process looks like in Prince William County schools. We have a two-tiered process where we have a school-based team at each of our schools, and they conduct the threat assessment. But cases that are considered to be a high risk are then referred for a level 2 assessment, which occurs at the central office. And that might include additional interviews with the student of concern or other people or other information gathering or additional consultation with law enforcement. But it always includes my consultation with the school team to help strategize in case management and decision making. The advantage of this two-level system, I think, it allows us to have a centralized monitoring and management of the threat assessment process as it's being conducted across the division, and to support and monitor students who may be considered at risk, at an increased risk over time as they move from grade to grade and school to school. In relation to the element 1, our threat assessment process is also heavily influenced by the other violence prevention efforts that we have in place, our anti-bullying work that we do, positive school climate, working on student engagement and mental health awareness. And we really collaborate across departments to place threat assessment in the context of all of these other facets that we do. So for example, we consider that in light of the to address potentially broader issues.
Thank you. And Donna, your thoughts on this?
Can you hear me, Paul?
Yes, we can.
Well, I want to follow up on what Dolores said. I think it's absolutely crucial when the General Assembly decides from a state level that they want to implement threat assessment and they direct a particular agency, in this case the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety at DCJS, to develop a model include our partners like the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services to let them know from a counseling standpoint
we keep those things in mind and we're working collaboratively to ensure that we're following, best practice.
Great, thank you. And Donna?
Well, we're very lucky here in Virginia in that our General Assembly is very much on the cutting edge of creating new legislative mandates, and I believe we were the first in the nation to mandate threat assessment teams for K-12 and for higher ed for that matter. And at the time that they did so, we had data that indicated that 50% of schools in Virginia were already having threat assessment teams formed in their schools. So it was really important when we were developing model policies and implementing a statewide mandate that we took into consideration what schools were currently doing. So the mandate to have teams resulted in a need for a great deal of education and support from the state in terms of guidance and training and the development of reporting procedures. And we were very fortunate to receive grants both from the federal government but also from other sister agencies here in the state to not only support our training and consultant expertise that we were able to get on board, but also to study what we're doing and to see if the mandate to have threat assessment teams was affecting discipline outcomes. We have legislation in the state that requires higher ed. That's been in place since 2008 for higher education, institutions of higher education to have threat assessment teams. Our K-12 mandate came into play in 2013, and it required the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety to develop these model policies, to have school divisions required to have multidisciplinary teams that had expertise in counseling, law enforcement, instruction, and administration. In addition, the law mandated that they report data to the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety. We additionally came back with new laws last year and the year before where we saw a need to massage that legislation some to provide civil immunity to those people who were reporting threats, so there are protections there for folks to, again, report concerning behavior. But we also, in the last year, allowed the threat assessment teams to access adult and juvenile criminal records and health records. And there are exemptions from the Freedom of Information Act. And most recently, we changed the word students to individuals, where originally our legislation said that we're supposed to look at students that were posing a threat to harm themselves or others. Now it's just individuals, because as we know, sometimes people closely or loosely affiliated with the school will also pose a threat to school.
Thank you, sir. The threat assessment will be more effective if it's supported with clear policies, goals, roles, and responsibilities from the district and or school. Policies can cover aspects of the many aspects of reporting a threat. Threat assessment teams' authority to conduct an inquiry, threshold of concern for starting an inquiry into a threat, gathering and sharing the information. Different people said different things about the student. The team must have the ability to collect this information from a variety of sources, store the information, share with others when appropriate, taking into consideration civil rights and other applicable laws. As stated previously, the primary purpose of the CA's Center's threat assessment approach is to prevent targeted violence in schools by students. Schools may widen and include bullying, like self-harm, threats posed by adults. Whatever is decided upon, the threat team must be clear what. The team members understand their roles and responsibilities in the team, including the role of law enforcement. So I'd like to start with John Ellenden. Do you have any thoughts?
Yes. outline the steps that should be taken, but it's really critical to continue to provide ongoing support and guidance in how to implement those guidelines.
The elements of the photo. So a benefit to effective, collaborate, various partners, family, and externally of the school input. So we can react to it, so that information can be shared before, during, and after an incident. Any information sharing must be made in compliance with any federal, state, or local laws, including requirements of Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act or STARPA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act or HIPAA. Information can occur internally of staff members such as mental, behavioral health professionals, and general counsel. Students, parents and guardians, especially for local law enforcement, mental, behavioral health teams, community groups, including youth organizations such as Boys and Girls Clubs. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, internally, we emphasize that the team is primarily school-based, but it expands to the central office to include myself, risk management, or other members of the Office of Student Services. Encouraging collaboration among the school-based team is much more challenging than one might think. And so it's really important that we continue to try to develop those school-based teams. Externally, given the size of our division, as you said earlier, we have 94 schools and over 85,000 students. The external collaboration occurs primarily at the central office level. An example of one of the things that we've done is we have developed an information sharing protocol with law enforcement that is outside of our MOU formalizing the relationship with SLA, that is specific to the schools carrying out the threat assessment process. So the law enforcement will provide information to central office, to my office, to risk management, if they go to a student's home investigating a threat. So there's not necessarily information that will go back to the school, but it does come back to us at central office and does, again, assist us in managing that student over the long term. So that has been something that's been very helpful.
Thank you, Anna. Any thoughts?
Yes, threat assessment can absolutely not be done in a vacuum. The importance of establishing solid relationships with all of your partners cannot be underscored. It's critical to have these relationships made ahead of time and to understand that the purpose, so that everyone understands what the purpose of the threat assessment team is. It's a prevention and intervention process which can support students whose behaviors are causing concern. But in order for that to occur, everyone has to trust the team, its processes and goals, and the way that you get them to trust you is to communicate that to the students and the staff and the school community as a whole. We had school divisions contact us and said, how do we tell people about threat assessment? So the VCSCS responded by developing a video which addresses a piece of the legislation that says that schools are to give guidance to students, faculty, and staff regarding the recognition of threatening or aberrant behavior that represents a threat to the community, and identify members of the team to whom they should support or report this information. And we hope that that video helps communicate to everyone why threat assessment is going on. Threat assessment is very much of a law enforcement term to people, and it concerns people when they hear those words. And so communicating both to your partners internally and externally why you have these processes and what you're intending to do by going through these processes, and that the outcome is really supporting the student and reducing, getting them off of a pathway to violence is the end goal. So that cannot be underscored.
Thank you. Let's move on to number 5. Threat assessment is best conducted with a trained multidisciplinary team. Threat assessment team can be formed with a space at the school and district level, should be chaired by a school administrator and include respective member of the faculty or administration, an investigator such as a school resource officer or a police officer assigned to the school, mentor for a health professional, a clinical psychologist or psychologist, We need more. Maybe minutes right now. We're getting rid of it. One final conversation. With Helen, you please. So we need Sean to find out what things you want to do. In addition, the that we train people, administrators, staff, faculty, and to provide them information threatening to deal with the actual threat. This type of students that place emotional and behavioral support, objects that are concerned, and media literacy, being the changes of mental health line. These groups such as those in the support and help raise concerns about a student after the student can support. One of your thoughts?
Well, I think it's really important that every member of the team is trained, and so the VCFPS tries to help by providing one-day K-12 threat assessment team training. We've developed a curriculum to help support them so that they can train their own team members. We've also created a separate course on addressing the legal issues surrounding that team, because inevitably people have concerns about what their role is and whether their role is violating other federal laws. We've also provided a train-the-trainer curriculum. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to continually train and retrain and make information available to the team. The other thing that we've done is we've hosted a couple of statewide conferences on the K-12 through higher education threat assessment teams, the transfer of information from the K-12 level to the higher ed level to follow the student to help provide support to higher education when the child leaves K-12.
So thank you. Actually, there's a quick logistical announcement.
Yes, good afternoon everyone. Please take a moment to ensure that your telephone line is muted. If you aren't sure, please take a moment to press *6 on your line. Thank you.
And you have showed to move on to element number 6. One common element in effective threat assessment is that it's conducted along a continuum that gives districts, schools, and threat assessment teams flexibility in how they respond to a potential threat. Threat assessments typically begin with an inquiry by the district or school. Based on the information evaluated in this inquiry, the threat assessment team may determine that any threat posed may be addressed without support or resources external to the school or district. A range of corrective disciplinary actions may be implemented, such as counseling, detention, short to long-term suspension, or expulsion. Threat assessment team may also determine that external support is needed through collaboration with licensed law enforcement, juvenile justice, and mental behavioral support teams. Ultimately, the case may need to be handed over to law enforcement for their own investigations. Having the process along a continuum, districts and schools are able to quickly assess the level of threat posed, respond to a threat approach, and bring in additional support and resources if needed. As part of the threat assessment, the district or school needs a method to analyze the information it receives. The method index, which is popular with threat assessment approaches, is produced in 11 key questions put forth by the FSI. Dolores, your thoughts on this?
Yes, we have a structured assessment form that we use for all threat assessments, and that includes the 11 key SSI questions. And teams use that to guide their decision making. Based on their determination of the level of risk, additional resources or interventions are necessary on the situation. And we do have some flexibility in terms of how those teams actually conduct the assessment. And one of the things that I think is a really important lesson that has been learned is that you really have to pay attention to what the norms are within any school, and what is the team that is already there, and work to sort of shape that team into functioning in a threat assessment process. And that's really a key piece, to give acknowledgement to what those norms are in schools and to work with them in order to ensure that there's good communication across the team.
Thank you. We move on to element number 7. The threat assessment approach supports the student or students posing the threat. As stated previously, the intent of our threat assessment isn't just to punish students, but instead to intervene, thwart violence, and provide them support. Therefore, the threat assessment team may decide that the student or students who pose creation of an action plan that details aspects such as whether a mental health evaluation is needed, internal or external to the school, what interventions may be needed to help address the underlying cause of the threat, such as anger management training, counseling or conflict resolution, and how the student may be monitored and the case reviewed if necessary. One way to achieve this is through the implementation of tiered support, such as with positive intervention and support, or PBI. PBI's program is intended to provide comprehensive and positive resources to schools and students. It can help reduce the need for disciplinary actions and improve academic, social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes for students. The program of threat may also need support, so the support school may offer services such as counseling, and any issues brought up, such as discipline needs, can be addressed. Donna, your thoughts on the second?
Well, again, you've already hit the nail on the head. It's absolutely what the end goal is to support students and get them to stay connected and engaged with school. And in order to do that, sometimes school divisions need help in identifying resources outside or within their school community, within the community to help get students the resources that they need. I'd also like to add here that a lot of people are very afraid that threat assessment is just a hammer that people are going to use to disconnect kids from school or up their suspensions and expulsions or discipline issues. And our initial studies on this from the National Institute of Justice, a partnership we have in a grant with UVA, is that threat assessment, when done properly, are actually reducing suspensions and expulsions and disciplinary actions because we're using an information gathering system to assess what is actually going on with that student and to get them back engaged with school and off of any type of pathway to violence. And so I think that it's absolutely the end goal that we have supports in place and help school divisions identify those supports to keep kids in school.
And Carol, if I can chime in on that. The major focus of threat assessment process, as it is conceptualized, it's a very positive process. It is a way that we are able to identify the underlying causes for the behavior that presents itself as a concern and to address them. And so for our students, if they go through a threat assessment and it is determined that there is an area of concern, there is ongoing case management where we then put interventions in place and then check back in with that student and continue to monitor them over time. And I think that's really an important piece to emphasize. It really is a very positive process, and it is viewed that way in our division and even with families, which might be surprising to some people. But I think it really is intended to identify what those underlying issues are that are causing the student to behave in a way or make statements or engage in some problematic behavior and to address them.
Absolutely, Joyce. That's excellent.
Thank you. We appreciate those comments. So we'll talk now about element number 8. The effectiveness of a threat assessment approach, especially if it has just been recently created, through regular tests to determine if it is meeting the purpose of the approach. It may be difficult to assess the effectiveness of an approach based on our focus, such as student active shooters in schools, as fortunately, incidents such as these are rare. Also, it can be hard to prove that program or policy prevented something. However, schools can prioritize the use of evidence-based prevention strategies, such as the PBIS framework I just mentioned. Also, if the focus of the threat assessment is broad in scope, such as to prevent or reduce incidents of bullying and self-harm, certainly the process is effective as easier. The district or school can monitor, for example, whether reported incidents of bullying decrease over time after the implementation of the process, and if the school climate has improved through climate assessment. Aspects to consider include does the threat assessment process meet goals, improve school safety, reduce suspension rates, improve discipline, or reduce bullying. Based on these assessments, the district or school may be able to determine whether the goals of the threat assessment are being met and whether any refinements to the process are warranted. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think implementing a threat assessment approach is absolutely an ongoing and dynamic process. It is a way of thinking about behaviors of concern that suggests the student may be on a path of targeted violence, and really what's suggested over time is not so much the threat assessment approach itself, but it really is about the level of training and the understanding that team members have about what it is we're looking for and how to manage concerned students over time. And really how the school climate can be improved to reduce violence or to identify problematic situations before violence occurs. I have been in this position for 3 years, and if I conducted the training that I'm doing this year with the school administrators and team members 3 years ago when the threat assessment teams became mandated, it would have been completely rejected as undoable. I mean, they would have seen it as too overwhelming. But now they're fully on board because it was more of a gradual shift. As Donna said earlier, our school division has had a threat assessment process in place for 15 years. But it did take a major shift in 2013 when the law was put into place. And so it is a continual process of kind of looking at where you are, how well the teams are working, what are the kinds of behaviors that are being identified, and are those the things that you want to be looking for. And the other piece that I think is really, really important is that you really have to be open to being reflective on your process and be willing to consider how well it works in any given situation. During the 2014-15 school year, for example, we did have we had a student who was ultimately convicted of being an ISIS recruiter and was in our high school for most of the year before he was ultimately convicted and went to prison. This was a huge wake-up call for us, and it really did give us the opportunity to reflect on how well we implemented our threat assessment protocol. How quickly, did we identify the behaviors of concern, and how did we respond to those teachers and students who raised concern? What did the communication look like with the FBI once they became involved? And I used that experience in my trainings to emphasize, number one, the validity of the SSI questions in terms of helping to identify the potential threats, but also to acknowledge to those school-based team members that we have very complicated jobs, and it's really critical that we work collaboratively as a team with the school, with central office, with law enforcement, to support the kind of climate that will allow our teachers and students to feel safe enough to tell us where there is a concern. So it is very much an ongoing and dynamic process where you have to be willing to reflect on how it's working and change accordingly.
Thank you. And before we finish our discussion about effective elements, I'd like to provide those speakers opportunity to provide some closing comments. Donna, do you have any closing remarks?
I want to re-emphasize what Dolores said, that from a state perspective, if you're embarking down this road, one, you have to know that it's not a quick fix. Threat assessment is a tool in a box, but it's also not a hammer you can use for everything, and it has to be integrated into the whole school environment. You have to gain consensus and get everybody on board. And when we started working on developing a model for the state, we, as you know, had several different models working throughout the state, where some schools had been using them, as Dolores indicated, for 12 years. So we put together an advisory committee, not just of state subject matter experts and practitioners, but we used national folks that had been doing this in the workplace for decades. And so it was very important that we had them review our model policy, and halfway through that policy, that review, they took a turn, and we ended up doing something a little different to, again, gain consensus from our partners. After that, implementing, we've had this on the books since 2013, and here we are in 2016, and we're still providing a plethora of training and resources and guidance and technical assistance from a subject matter expert we have on our consulting team here, as well as providing videos, etc. This is not a quick fix, and it is changing the culture of the school, but if you sell it into the positive mode that it's supposed to be, in that we're all trying to get kids to stay in the school, stay connected, and get to the underlying sources of behaviors or words that seem to pose a threat and solve those root issues so that they're not on a pathway to violence. then I think that you're halfway there. But I don't want people to think that there's a very quick, we're going to pass a law and it's going to be easy. But I would encourage you to steal from everybody you can and look at what's out there and get the subject matter experts together, convene a group, because again, as Dolores said, everybody has really tough jobs in school. They're already wearing a number of hats, and they see this as, do not put one more thing on me. But this isn't one more thing. This is a communication of people working together to solve problems, and everybody has a piece of that puzzle that can help keep that kid engaged in schools if we will only trust one another and communicate. That was excellent, Donna. That was very well said. Thanks.
Do you have any additional comments, Dolores?
I really don't. I think it's just that it's exactly as Donna said. I think you have to look at where you are and recognize it's a process and it's not going to happen overnight. And trust that it's all of these different facets that we're already doing in terms of aggressive learning or discipline and these other pieces. It's all interwoven, and that's it's a process, and you just have to keep moving forward and being willing to make small changes to get where we need to be to address support students who are in need.
And Dolores, I don't want people to leave thinking that it's this horrible task that somebody has to take on. I would say that it's been absolutely worthwhile the last 2 years for no other reason, if not helping students, but making partners talk to one another. We have such a great relationship between law enforcement and schools now because they're mandated to be on a team together. They're mandated to talk and communicate, and we're building relationships. And so if nothing else good came out of threat assessment in Virginia, it's that I think that we're getting disciplines to take down their walls and begin to talk to one another and share information comfortably, knowing that the end goal is we all want to keep kids out of the criminal justice system and in school.
And I agree. And a perfect example of that is when the threat assessment team first became mandated, we already had school resource officers in our schools. And one of the first things that I did was to meet with the supervisor of the SROs. And it was pretty clear that we had different ideas. They weren't really sure what the limits were in terms of our ability to intervene with the mental health needs of our very youngest students, K through 5. Sometimes we had needs that really needed law enforcement, to come to a school and support a third grader. And that wasn't always well received by law enforcement. But as we developed a relationship through the threat assessment process and we came to a shared understanding of what we were each doing in relation to supporting students over the long term and supporting families in our community, the overflow of that was law enforcement being much more understanding and responsive when they were called to a school by a principal over a second or a third grader. They understood where that fit in the perspective of long-term care for our citizens, if you will. So I think the benefits on the point are just very pervasive and very positive.
Dolores, thank you. Those were some really great points of the board. We really appreciate those thoughts and insights. We're now going to move on to the third and final section of the webinar, where we have students who could ask just 11 questions in the interest of time. So I have Dolores. Dolores, threat assessments have a negative connotation as they're related to violence. How do you respond to that?
I think that they do, but what I would say is it is how it is approached. In our division, I don't see that, because I think it's clear that it is about early intervention and about supporting students and families. And even when I work with parents, oftentimes we are able to identify underlying mental health issues, for example, that perhaps the family wasn't quite in a place where they were ready to address. And it allows us to be understanding about that and to connect them with the community resources. And they feel supported and they feel validated. the positive outcomes are far outweigh any negativity. And I think it is conceptualized as early intervention. And that's how I understand. I see it as nothing but positive and proactive. And I think if you believe that, then then that's how it's taken away. That's the taken away by parents and families and by schools.
Thank you. So the facility today has made their contact information available to those who may want to follow up with them individually. This information is on the slide now. And just a little reminder that the webinar is being recorded and archived and will be available on the Wellness TA Center's website. So you can also follow, take a look at the webinar there and also have a look at their contact information. You can also contact the TA Center for any questions or requests for technical assistance at info@wellnessTACenter.org. Or through the toll-free number 1-855-701-7367. The TA Center is hours of operation on Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We also encourage you to visit the TA Center website for additional information about TA Center resources, such as our community practice. After this webinar, we'll be having a Twitter chat for 1 hour where we'll be answering questions and sharing information about threat assessments in schools and paving the way. To follow us on Twitter, search for @WellnessTACenter and or hashtag K12 threat assessment. Thank you for your time today, and this concludes the webinar.